the newsagents.
An Ofsted inspection blamed as a likely contributor to this head teacher's decision to end her own life. Ruth Perry died in January this year. Today, her family listened as a coroner ruled her death could have been the result of stress caused by the inspection.
In January of 2023, Ruth Perry took her own life. She was a head teacher, you'll have heard of her, and she worked at Caversham Primary School in Berkshire. And her death followed an Ofsted inspection that saw her school fall from an outstanding ranking to inadequate. Today, we want to use Ruth Perry's death not as the culmination of what we're discussing, but as a starting point to ask wider questions about Ofsted, whether it's trusted, whether it's fit for purpose, and whether it is actually offering something useful to children, to parents, and for those who depend upon it.
So, a very simple question. Should Ofsted be fundamentally reformed, or indeed even scrapped? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And we're going to be devoting the whole show today to this question around Ofsted, which has really, to a greater or lesser extent, been in the headlines, as Emily was saying, for about a year following the tragic death of Ruth Perry, having taken her own life following that Ofsted inspection in Caversham Primary School. It has led to a cascade of other head teachers or teachers coming forward into the headlines, some of whom we're going to be hearing from in the show today, saying that her experience, though not extreme, resonates with them because the regime has become so arbitrary, so difficult to predict, so stressful that they are not surprised that it has culminated in this one particular case to a head teacher taking her own life.
Yeah, we're going to speak to Ruth Perry's sister, Julia Waters, in a moment, who talks us through not just the circumstances that led to her sister's suicide, but also what she believes to be other deaths of her teachers connected to, in some shape or form, the Ofsted inspections. And by the Ofsted inspections, just to clarify for anyone who's kind of come to this new, we're talking about those school visits that are, I guess, sort of placed on, inflicted on, you might say, schools to judge how they are faring. And there has been a tradition previously where if a school was given an outstanding rating, the very top rating, then it wasn't really revisited. It wasn't really re-inspected at all. So a school might have had an incredibly good rating for 20 years. That all changed in 2021. And a lot of teachers have expressed to us their sense that they live in fear, not just of the extra workload, but as Lewis was saying, of the arbitrariness of what the inspection will take in, how quickly it will all happen, and how maybe little chance they have to give their own feedback, to appeal or to provide context for what the inspectors are saying, because everything ultimately comes down to this one word ruling. You can either be outstanding if you're really lucky, you can be good, you can be satisfactory, or you can be inadequate. And if inadequate hits you, then that can lead to a change in leadership. It can lead to the school being turned into an academy. It can mean that people lose their jobs. And it can basically mean the end of the school as it is functioning in that way. So this is a really, really critical time and critical judgment on teachers, particularly on heads, with very little warning of what's coming at them.
Yeah, and this question of reform is becoming more acute, not least because Ofsted has got a newish chief inspector, Martyn Oliver, from whom we're also going to be hearing. But of course, this is like all matters around education or any bit of public policy. This is a finely balanced calibration because, of course, as stressful as an inspection might be, we also know that inspections, I think most experts would agree that rigorous inspections have been an important component of driving up standards. And there will be people who say that as stressful, again, as it might be for head teachers, or if they're worried about losing their jobs, well, maybe if their school is inadequate or not doing well, well, maybe they ought to fear for their jobs, because that would be the case in anybody's jobs if not they're not performing. Because we're going to talk to Julia Waters, as Emily was saying, the sister of Ruth Perry, just to give a bit of background for that case in particular. The reason that Ruth Perry's school was going to fail its report, indeed that it did, was a particular question around safeguarding. And if there are problems or significant problems around safeguarding, irrespective of how well that school might be doing in every other area, it will fail its inspection. For obvious reasons, safeguarding is so important. The initial language in that report said this. It said the arrangements for safeguarding in this school are not effective. Leaders have a weak understanding of safeguarding requirements and procedures. They have not exercised sufficient leadership or oversight of this important work. As a result, records of safeguarding concerns and the tracking of subsequent actions are poor. Leaders have not ensured that all required employment checks are complete for some staff employed at the school. These weaknesses pose potential risk to pupils. And they also said that leaders have not ensured there is always appropriate supervision during break times, and this means that pupils are potentially at risk of harm.
Yeah, and we're not trying to arbitrate the reasons behind Ruth Perry's death. We know that she was deeply, deeply unhappy, depressed, and indeed suicidal. She took her own life in those 50 days between the end of the Ofsted inspection and her death. But I think what we're trying to do is give you a little bit of context for how these inspections work, how easily it is to fall foul of them, and to raise the questions. I mean, as Lewis said, presumably safeguarding has to be a red line, and that's how inspectors are taught to carry out any of these checks. I guess when we talk to Julia, her sister, you'll understand why she is so deeply involved in trying to get reform so that these decisions do not look and sound as binary as they were with Ruth's school, that they offer up a little bit more context and a little bit more care to those professionals at the centre of it. Well, joining us now is Julia Waters. She's Ruth's sister. And I'd like to start, I guess, Julia, by just hearing a little bit about Ruth and about her dedication to the job and to the school.
Well, as I think has been said previously, we were both pupils at Caversham Primary ourselves back in the 1970s and had very, very happy memories of our time there. So I think when Ruth applied first of all for the post as deputy head, and then 4 years later the substantive head's post, it was with those kind of happy memories in mind, the kind of childhood we'd had, the kind of education we had had at that school. She actually made a sort of promotional video for the school in which she makes that point that if pupils have as happy a time at Caversham Primary as when she was a pupil there, she'd be very happy.
And in her years as the head there, did she seem to you to have taken on a lot more stress? Did she seem to you to be more, I guess, mentally vulnerable to the sort of strains of running the school itself?
No, she was remarkably resilient. She enjoyed her job. She worked very hard, as all head teachers do, and did face some significant challenges along the way, again, as all head teachers do. But actually, she took it in her stride. She was very competent, very experienced. She had senior roles in education previously, so she didn't come to it cold in any sense at all. So, you know, one of the reasons for my speaking out about what happened to Ruth is because of that. If an Ofsted inspection can do that to someone as tough and dedicated and well respected and experienced as my sister, it's a very dangerous system.
Before you heard about the tragedy that your sister had taken her own life, you had no indication that there was this stress or that this was sort of coming or anything like that?
Well, obviously I'd had 54, if you count the 2 days of the inspection, 56 days of being very, very well aware of how distressed Ruth was. But prior to the inspection, no, she was ready for the inspection. She was well prepared.
It was that period before the inspection where everything suddenly began to decline. And
the period after the inspection.
Oh, the period after the inspection.
The period after the inspection. She was fine. She was fine up to the inspection. She ran a brilliant school that was oversubscribed, that had high levels of satisfaction and engagement from the parents, had excellent results, really high attendance. I mean, all markers were excellent. She had volunteered to be part of a pilot inspection just 3 years previously that was overseen by Amanda Spielman, and they gained glowing feedback, including on safeguarding. So she was confident. When the lead inspector phoned her the day before the inspection, she'd said to him, "We've been ready for this for a long time." She was looking forward to showing off the many strengths of her school. But it didn't go like that. And from the start of the inspection, as the inquest showed, right from the start of the inspection, the very first meeting she had with the lead inspector, she left that meeting almost unable to speak and in a terrible state. And that continued. So, no, prior to the inspection, Ruth had no history whatsoever of any mental ill health. She was remarkably resilient. She was healthy, happy, successful, popular. It was the inspection that did that to her. You know, whatever else they find, if they go in and they find something wrong with safeguarding,
that's it.
That's it. And the report sort of shows that. It's good, with actually some sort of hesitation on a couple of the categories over outstanding. And this is good under the new framework, which is tougher than the one when they had previously been given outstanding. So, first of all, what Ruth told me, but was confirmed in the inquest, long and thorough inquest, was that the lead inspector sort of went in with a bit of an agenda, and as soon as he found something, it was then like a dog with a bone. And, you know, for me, it looked like a serious case of confirmation bias, then trying to find things that backed up that initial slip, paperwork slip. And something like safeguarding that is so poorly defined, is so important but is so poorly defined, is clearly something it's all or nothing. It's safeguarding's used as a limiting judgment. So if they find that, however strong the school is, however positive the parent feedback, which
That's
it was,
instant black mark.
It's an instant black mark. Exactly.
Julia, as you know, the ex-Ofsted boss, Dame Christine Gilbert, has been appointed by Sir Martyn Oliver, the current one, to review the circumstances, what happened with your sister's death. How confident are you about that process and about what might happen there?
I have heard some very good things about Christine Gilbert herself. She has sort of relevant experience and seems to be highly regarded. But this is meant to be an independent review. I cannot see how a former chief inspector, a former head of Ofsted, however rigorous she may try to be, can possibly be truly impartial and independent. Or there's also the danger of how she will be perceived to be impartial and independent. There are still people in Ofsted she will have worked with. There are still systems in place at Ofsted that she used, maybe even implemented. So there is, at least as the teaching unions have said as well, the perception of Ofsted trying to, in this case, set its own homework and getting a close friend to market for them.
How would you like the overall Ofsted regime to be reformed?
There's been lots of discussion about particular features of the current framework, systems, culture that need to be addressed. And we could go into some of that detail. But I think that for me, the key problem with Ofsted is its defensiveness and its lack of accountability, the power it wields over schools. There's this ridiculous imbalance of power, and it's not just an imbalance of power that's inherent to any inspector-inspected relationship. Ofsted wields maximum power and has zero accountability, whereas schools are subject to maximum accountability but have very, very little power. And a key area where this is shown is around the complaints. It is virtually impossible to complain.
So you can't appeal as
You
a
can't.
school?
There is no process for appealing a judgment. There is no process for appealing a judgment.
Which I think a lot of people would be surprised by.
Yeah. And there are very limited grounds on which a school is even allowed to put in a complaint. And Ofsted decides what those grounds are. And then Ofsted considers any complaint that comes in. And Ofsted alone has access to the evidence base on which the judgment was made. A head teacher who wanted to put in a complaint about their inspection doesn't have access to the evidence base that the inspectors draw up to justify
So you're
that
talking
judgment.
about basically a massive imbalance of power.
Massive imbalance, and it's sort of carrying on still. You know, that the changes that have come in so far, there've been a few as a result of my speaking out, as a result of the inquest, but they really don't address that imbalance of power and the lack of accountability on the part of Ofsted.
We're going to be speaking to Martyn Oliver, and I'm sure you have been in conversations with him. What does he need to tell us, to tell you?
I need to be reassured that he actually gets it. You know, he's had, or Ofsted received, as did the Department for Education, a prevention of future deaths report coming out of the inquest, which highlighted several points, several failings and dangers within the system. The coroner said there is a risk of future deaths if only lip service is paid to learning from tragedies like these. And so far, all I've seen is lip service. And launching a big a listening process at a time when urgent action is needed to prevent other deaths. And there have been at least 10, apart from Ruth, that we know of. And in the last year, I've been contacted by people who told me of other suicides and heart attacks. And
head teacher
10
suicides?
Yes.
That have named Ofsted? No.
Yes, that have named Ofsted in the coroner's reports. There haven't been prevention of future deaths reports issued previously, and this is the first time that a coroner has ruled that an Ofsted inspection contributed to a death. But there are other suicides on record where the coroner has cited an Ofsted inspection as being a contributory factor.
Julia, thank you so much. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Well, we're joined now by Lee Parkinson to get the view, I suppose, from the coalface, really, because he's a primary school teacher, blogger as well, known as Mr. Parkinson, he tells us, in the classroom, and Mr. P online. You'll find him on Instagram. Yeah. Lee, Mr. Parkinson, Mr. P, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Can you give us a sense, exactly that really, what is it like as a teacher, a working teacher, when you know that Ofsted are just around the corner?
It's stressful. It's a worry, because ultimately we know as teachers our job is so important. It's not a case that we're saying we don't want to be accountable. Obviously we need to be accountable, but I think I speak on behalf of the profession when I say we want a system that's constructive, fair, supportive, and most importantly consistent. And I don't think you'll find many, if any, teachers working in a school that think Ofsted is that in its current form. You know, they're inspecting schools, wanting to see a Lamborghini school when we've all got the budget of a Nissan Micra. And it's that inconsistency, I think, that is really important, because, you know, inspectors bring so many of their opinions, so much of the process is subjective, and they will bring agendas. I'll just give you an example. I did work in a school recently who had a pretty bad Ofsted inspection, and the inspector looked into their RE curriculum. Now, this school is sort of a lead school, so they've written this curriculum, they've implemented it in their school, and this inspector tore it to shreds, said it was no good, and that contributed to the inspection not being very good. School down the road, partner school, with the same RE curriculum written by this lead school, that came out flourishing by a different inspector. So it's that sort of inconsistency. And I think, you know, look, I don't want to tar every inspector with the same brush, because I recognise there's some great inspectors out there. You know, just this week in my school, we've had Ofsted in. Oh, wow. And I want to say, the inspectors that have come in have been fair, supportive, and it's actually been quite a positive experience. Now, that's what it should be like across the board.
But you're saying that that is fundamentally inconsistent and arbitrary. It kind of basically depends who you get on the day,
Yeah.
and that there's a fundamental unfairness about that.
Absolutely. So when I tweeted that we've had the call, the dreaded phrase, I've had maybe half a dozen messages from teachers saying they've had the call as well, and it's been dreadful, which is different to my experience. The message I've been getting more than anything else is sort of good luck with it. And that's what it comes down to. It is a lottery as to whether you get the right inspector who's got experience in the same setting you're teaching in. And ultimately, if you've got the old head of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, saying that the inspection that happened in Ruth Perry's school was error-free and there was nothing wrong with it, even though the coroner said it was intimidating, how many of the inspectors are going to have that mindset, And it only takes a few bad eggs to create that pressure, that fear. Because if schools know there's a slight chance you might get one of these rogue inspectors, that's what's putting that pressure, that worry, that fear, which then consequently has an impact on workload. So whether it's directly or indirectly, Ofsted are the main reason why workload is at breaking point for the majority of teachers. And that's then having a knock-on impact on numbers of teachers. So just in the last year, 40,000 teachers have left the profession. And if you're to ask most of them, they will put it down to workload as a consequence of
Is that
this
right?
inspection.
But given Ofsted inspections are so infrequent, can it be that Ofsted inspections are the main or primary driver of teachers' workload?
Yeah, because you've only got to look at the new inspection framework, and teachers, as a primary school teacher, you're not just a teacher now. You've got to be an expert in a subject. Most of us didn't learn past GCSE, have all this evidence of how the subject's being taught. Just all this extra workload.
Well, you're having to do it as you go along, you mean, in anticipation of the next inspection?
Yeah,
right.
And it can happen at any time. And again, you've got to get every base covered, because it's sort of this mentality of we're not going to be trusted, we're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt, so therefore we've got to make sure everything's covered, and that creates that sort of stress. And ultimately, the consequence of a bad inspection means your livelihood's on the line. And inadequate grading, you then get taken over by a MAT, and people's jobs are on the line. So look, I know the new head of Ofsted is sort of saying the right things. He's far more qualified than his predecessor, because he's worked in a school. And he's saying the right things so far, but it's more about the action, and it's all well and good saying one thing, but then if you don't follow it through, I mean, for me, what I think Ofsted could do is get rid of the gradings. I don't think that needs to happen. Identifying strengths of a school, areas for development, is more important than a one-word label that we've already seen can have toxic, it can be quite, I know what Ofsted will say is it's beyond their remit, it's a DFE decision, but if that's something they know would bring positive change and be quite welcome from the profession, I think they should be pushing that forward. And more transparency from them. There was a case recently where loads of these sort of crib sheets got leaked online, so these sort of almost like cheat sheets were given to inspectors about inspecting. And because a lot of inspectors work in schools, they were feeding that back to their staff, which was putting them at an advantage compared to other schools. So I think the training materials and what inspectors get access to should be freely available for schools to know exactly what they're looking at and what to expect.
Yeah, I know you're not a fan of Amanda Spellman. I get that many in your profession probably feel very strongly about the way she dealt with and talked about Ruth Perry's death. But one thing that she does say is that her job fundamentally is to protect the interests of children. And you can't go around making sure that you never say anything that will upset the educators or the teachers. And that at the heart of what that inspector found in Ruth's school was a breaking of standards over safeguarding. I think it was, Julia's talked to us about the record keeping. We understand from the coroner's report, it was also about adequate supervision at break time. Do you get that there have to be some red lines that you cannot get wrong?
Absolutely, but I think there's a manner in which you can go about that that doesn't intimidate and create a system where teachers are so fearful and worried. It can be done more constructively. Absolutely, I'm not saying that every school in the country is perfect and every school is outstanding. Obviously, there's schools that need to improve in certain areas. I think just the way they go about conduct, and they're doing more to put those worries at bay and sort of presenting.
I mean, isn't all criticism going to be difficult to hear? You know, you're doing your job, you're working, you know, 1 billion hours a week, you're absolutely on your knees, you think you're doing everything you can for the kids. Of course, no teacher in that situation wants to hear that they're doing anything wrong, but I guess there will be some times when they are told things aren't going well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, with every inspection, every school comes out with areas to develop. So it's not a case that you're ever going to get a perfect inspection. Like I say, I think it's the manner in which you can go about it and, you know, doing it in a supportive and constructive way, and ultimately do it in a way that, encourages teachers to improve, not panic and worry about the consequences of then losing their job.
Although sometimes presumably some of them should lose their jobs. And that is a legitimate outcome of an inspection. Potentially, but the fear that brings, I don't think is then necessarily having a positive impact. If no parent is going to want to be taught by a teacher who's overworked, burnt out and stressed, caused by the impending inspection or the potential of not getting a fair inspection. So I think there's a way in which we can create a system where we can keep those high standards, absolutely keep those high standards, but done in a way that's constructive, that is supportive, and isn't then creating, a mindset where so many teachers are leaving through burnout and mental health issues. And ultimately, I feel we're at a breaking point where we could possibly get to a point where the inspectors have no one to inspect because there's not enough teachers coming into the profession, and the retention rate's even worse. And I think Ofsted need to take some responsibility in how they can address those retention issues, because, the stories I get sent about how teachers are leaving in their droves, a lot contributed to the pressure of Ofsted, the workload within Ofsted isn't sustainable. So, it's not a case that I want to see Ofsted gone. It's a way in which we can create a system that's fair, consistent and supportive.
It's so good to talk to you, Lee. Mr. P,
thank you so much.
You very much. Really good to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
I think the really interesting thing that both Julia and Lee have identified there, or the theme they keep coming up with, which I think is really interesting, is this idea of just how unaccountable Ofsted is, and that how powerless an individual head or an individual school can feel in the weight of basically what is a massive bureaucratic government machine, which is pretty opaque and for which there is, they feel, little course of redress. And it's very interesting that in particular Julia should invoke the post office scandal with regards to that. Again, another big government machine where you have individuals who don't feel that they have much power to address them, but we do, because we're going to talk to the actual new boss of Ofsted, Sir Martyn Oliver, just after this.
So, as Lewis said, we're going to spend this half trying to get to understand what Ofsted believes its own challenges are and whether it thinks it is fit for purpose. Sir Martyn Oliver has only been in the job 3 months. He took over from Amanda Spielman, and last month he gave an interview to our colleague Rachel Johnson on her podcast Difficult Women, and she was asked specifically about the case of Ruth Perry's suicide and whether the inspectors had got it wrong and how she reflected on that time. And this is what she told Rachel.
You wouldn't have wanted Ofsted to do anything differently when it came to that particular school. You think Ofsted did exactly the right thing at the right time?
I'm not going to talk at that level about that particular case. As I say, it is for my successor.
But you were there at the time, leading the organisation when it went through probably its greatest crisis.
I absolutely did what I think was the right thing at a tremendously difficult time when it would have been very easy to say we got the inspection wrong. I couldn't do that. I didn't do that.
You issued an apology on behalf of Ofsted. Were you tempted to issue a mea culpa yourself just to make yourself feel better about what happened, or were you absolutely convinced that apologising on behalf of Ofsted was the correct thing to do?
Oh, I was the chief inspector, so apologising on behalf of Ofsted was absolutely the right way to approach it.
But what were you apologising for?
We were apologising for the distress that resulted, but
I think it was the right thing to do in the circumstances, because you'd had the coroner's inquest, and I think that's when you issued the apology.
No, I think we'd said something before that. I'm sure that we'd put out several statements earlier than that.
I'm sure you did.
Well, joining us now is Sir Martyn Oliver. He is the new Chief Inspector of Ofsted. You've only been in the job, Martyn, 3 months or so it must all feel a bit fresh. You come from a teaching background, which I know will be important to a lot of the people that you're inspecting. And I guess the wide question that we're asking on today's episode is if Ofsted is fit for purpose. And can you say, hand on heart, it is?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's not to say that I don't think there are things we can do to improve. I think it's difficult right now in 2024, not just the schools, and I think it's really important that people who are listening to this understand that Ofsted doesn't just inspect and regulate schools, but we have early years childminders, colleges. We even do the Ministry of Defence, prisons, all sorts. It's actually 97,000 institutions that we inspect and regulate, so not just the 22,000 schools. And do I think it's fit for purpose? Well, look, I went to school in the 70s and 80s, and some brilliant teachers taught me, but on the whole, standards were just not good then. And since Ofsted came around, it's an awful lot better. So yes, I think it is.
Let's play you, if we can, some of the responses from teachers to our question.
As a secondary school teacher, I believe that Ofsted is first and foremost a safety check. They should be welcomed into schools. The most fundamental and underappreciated role that Ofsted play is to review safeguarding practices to ensure that schools keep children safe whilst they're in their care.
Ofsted is a real driver of workload for normal teaching staff. It's also a massive issue when it comes to the recruitment and retention of head teachers and senior leaders. They are fearful of Ofsted because it can make or break their careers.
When you enter the possible inspection window, all of your meetings and tasks become obsessively focused on pleasing Ofsted. When the inspection does happen, staff can feel like they can't be fully honest in case it has a negative impact on the school's grade. There's also an imbalance where some schools can get inside information about specifics of inspections because members of their leadership teams also work for Ofsted.
I cannot emphasise this enough. Ofsted are not the problem. The build-up and pressure is. The tasks, paperwork and lesson observations by the school's leadership team in preparation for Ofsted are what are damaging the workforce.
No competent classroom teacher ever needs to fear Ofsted. I've been part of the process twice across 2 different schools and found inspectors to be friendly and genuinely interested in observing my practice. The fear of Ofsted trickles down from the top. It can make or break a head teacher's career, so they push their staff hard when an inspection's due.
I'm really behind the idea of having inspections of some form to monitor standards. I think that's really important, but the current system just doesn't work. I think it needs to be more supportive and less high stakes.
There are solutions to relieving this pressure. Number 1, more regular inspections so that they're lower stakes. Number 2, removing the half-day warning so that pressure is not put onto heads of department last minute. And number 3, the most important, removing the one-word grading system.
So Martyn, you heard their selection of views. Most of them, you will have noticed, they're not against the idea of being inspected. They're not against Ofsted, but they are against the way it's being conducted at the moment. And, so would you be willing to address some of those concerns? And what's your reaction to what you've heard?
Well, absolutely. And, and as you said, there was a mixed bag of responses there. And it's great to hear and sobering to hear some of them. And that's exactly what I want to do as part of something I'm doing right now, which is do a big listen. So right now there's a consultation, gov.uk/Ofsted Big Listen, where I'm trying to gather the views of not just those that we inspect and regulate, but those that we actually work for, so parents and children. And there's a children's version of this too. So I'm gathering all of those views right now as we look to see what further reforms we can do.
I'm surprised to some extent that you would be so fulsome in your answer as to say that so confident that Ofsted is fit for purpose, given everything we know that happened with Ruth Perry?
Well, I said do I think Ofsted is fit for purpose as an organisation? Yes, it is. Do I think it can do better? Yes, I do. I think
it clearly could have done better in that case.
Oh, yeah, and as I did, as my predecessor, Amanda Spearman, who was the longest serving chief inspector, she accepted the coroner's report, and when I started, I fully accepted the coroner's report, and I responded not just to it, but beyond in my response to it, because I recognise there are things we can do to be better.
But if it happened, well, clearly, but if it happened there, it could happen again, couldn't it? Unless Ofsted changes the way it conducts itself.
Which is why, even before I started to put in place different aspects. So, building upon the changes that happened last year, I put in place mental health first aid training for all of our inspectors, introduced a pause policy, have introduced ways of working to ensure that we understand who is responsible, who can support leaders during an inspection. We've introduced a new complaints policy now, and now we're undertaking the big listen and working out what longer term, more meaningful reforms we can make.
But how long is the average inspection these days?
Well, in a school, they are 2 days.
2 days. I mean, that's not much time, is it? I mean, it's not much time to, given that you inspect so infrequently, which is one of the views that we heard there, it's not much time to truly understand, surely, how a school is doing on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
And that's really interesting, and part of not just the coroner's inquest, but then in Parliament there's an Education Select Committee, and they have a hearing, and they did an inquiry into Ofsted, and some of the recommendations that they came back, and again I've responded to those. They've talked about the funding that Ofsted has, and since 2005 we've been asked to do more and more and more, but since 2009-10 we've had in real terms a 29% cut to our budget.
So you're saying you don't have enough inspectors?
So I have enough inspectors for the model that we have right now, but for example I would like to see that we have lead inspectors and we have additional people on teams, and we can take longer, we can be more considerate to the context. But that alone, to undertake that just in schools alone, not just, remember that's only 22,000 of the 97,000 institutions that we inspect and regulate, that would cost about £8.5 million more. And right now, schools are finding budgets tight, the systems have got tight budgets. You know, there are difficult decisions to be made. Who gets that money? And I don't think Ofsted should be at the front of that queue, but I do think it would be a different process should we be funded better to do this work, and I think that's important.
Martyn, can we drill down into the changes that you're prepared to make that don't require money? You've heard that request there to end the one-word slogan. It doesn't exist in Scotland. It doesn't exist in Wales. It doesn't exist in private schools. We were told by Ruth Perry's sister Julia just now that it only exists as a model in England's state schools. Why do you persist with it?
Well, why do I persist in it? Remember, I started, as you started off by saying, in Jan, it's the system I've inherited. I don't have an ideological position here. It's really complex. There are strengths and weaknesses to this position. And whilst I do have my own views, right now I want to hear what the general population thinks about things like the single word grade.
What's your sense of it?
Well, as I said, I think there are strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are it's really simple and it's easy to understand. It provides clarity. You can describe.
But so is bad
school.
And good. I mean, you don't want to patronise parents to thinking that they can't take a little bit more nuance or a little bit more context.
Well, I was going to say, and the weakness to it is that it is so simple, and sometimes that doesn't understand that context and that nuance. But not everyone carries that opinion. So of some of the other elements that we inspect and regulate, I met with large organisations that represent the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of early years and nurseries. And they were saying that for many of their people, they actually like the single word grade. And you can walk out of these studios and it won't be long before you'll come across somewhere where they've got a banner outside saying that it's Ofsted good or it's Ofsted outstanding. So it's not a universal opinion. I want to hear what people think.
Why do you think they got rid of them in
that.
Scotland then? Why do you think they got rid of them in Wales? Why do you think they don't do them in the very privileged private sector?
Well, and as part of the big listen, I've had a good series of meetings with the Independent Schools Inspectorate and met their chief executive before I started the role and since I've started the role as part of that listening exercise. And they are perhaps some of the changes that we may have to consider going forward. But right now, We are a non-ministerial department of government, and I work to the government of the day, and the government is and has a view that single word grades are important to them and has an awful lot of interventions based on the back of those grades.
So it has to come from Gillian Keegan if anything changes.
We have to recognise we're one part of a cog of a big machinery. We only inspect schools. We inspect and regulate other parts of our remit, but not schools.
If I'm a head teacher and I've just received a requires improvement rating for my school, or even a satisfactory one, or I'm just unhappy with an element of the inspection that's just taken place, what are my rights of recourse in that situation?
Okay, and I was a head, and I've had every judgment, mostly, thankfully, good and outstanding judgments in my career of the 42 schools that I used to run before coming onto this role, and some of those were requires improvement, and some of those even were unfortunately inadequate. But right now, you get the right, and under the new process that we've put in place, which only just came out last week, you get the right to have a check with a senior inspector as part of the inspection process. You can follow that back up immediately after the process. We have a quality assurance. We now have inspectors from other areas of the country looking at these reviews.
You think there is actually satisfactory right of recourse for head teachers at the moment? Because again, something that we've heard is that they don't feel that's right, that there's a fundamental imbalance between themselves as institutions and schools and you as a government body.
Yeah, and again, that's why, as part of the big listen, we're wanting to hear what people think about that. We do
you
have
must know that, Sir Martyn. You must know that's how they feel.
Well,
you need to be told it, and you've been in the education sector a long time.
Yeah, nearly 30 years. Yeah. But I don't want to presume. Look, it would have been really easy for me to have turned up and said, look, I'm 28 years in, I've run one of the largest trusts in the country, I've had nearly 100 inspections myself over my entire career, this is what needs to happen.
Well, isn't that what leadership is? I mean, rather than a big conversation or a big listen, sounds a bit like a PR exercise that you can hide behind if you know what you want to do.
No, not at all. I think it's really important with something like this that you understand the changes, and anything that Ofsted does has consequences. It has intended consequences, but also unintended consequences, and you have to make those changes really carefully.
Can we talk about Amanda Spielman and your predecessor, and her response after Ruth Perry's death and after the coroner's report? She was asked about the inspectors of that school, and she said, I absolutely did what I think was the right thing at a tremendously difficult time. It would have been easy to say we got the inspection wrong. I couldn't do that. I didn't do that. The thing I've found people incredibly unwilling to acknowledge and discuss is that there's no possible way you can make everybody perfectly happy. Was her response the right one?
Well, look, Amanda was the longest serving chief inspector, and she's entitled to say what she thinks. Amanda also, and I have a great deal of respect for Amanda, but Amanda also did say in the last weeks of her office that she accepted the coroner's findings. And my focus now is on the next 5 years.
Her tone, her approach.
Well, again, that's the question for Amanda. My focus is on the next 5 years. And
well, I'm asking if you think it was the right one, because Julia just told us that Ruth was not the only suicide. She believes there were up to 10 other suicides that were connected to Ofsted inspections. Does that shock you?
Ruth shocked me, as I said. I felt it as a fellow head teacher. I found that a shocking thing to hear.
But it wasn't unique. That's my point.
And that's why, as part of coming, I resolved to make an application knowing that Amanda's term of office was coming to an end before the tragic loss of Ruth. And even after that awful event, I was absolutely certain to make that application and to try and get the job. And thankfully I did, knowing that I would bring that experience of having been a teacher, a head teacher, a senior leader, and somebody who worked across multiple schools and had sometimes not just one inspection a week, but 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 inspections over a period of a fortnight.
But in a sense, Martyn, I mean, those two things are mutually incompatible, aren't they? Accepting the coroner's report and Amanda Spielman's words, initially her reaction, they're not compatible.
Well, again,
one must be right and one must be wrong.
Well, that's a question for her. I know that she accepted the report.
Not really.
I know that. Well,
I mean, you're in this job now. You have to be the outward face to tell people they can trust what Ofsted is doing now.
And that's why, in my response and all of the meetings and all of the things that I've said, and right now I've said that I understand that Ofsted can do better. Public bodies are finding it difficult in 2024, and no matter how well you're doing, we can all do better. I've run outstanding schools and I think they could do better. it's difficult. Right now we're dealing with all sorts of issues, whether it's behaviour, attendance, funding, recruitment and retention of teachers. There are so many things out there, the mental health of young people. And so therefore it's really important that as the organisation that inspects and regulates those people who are carrying out that massively important duty, that we have high standards, but we also understand the context in which they're working. And I'm trying to bring that experience from my 30 nearly years of doing this into this role forward to make it better.
Are there Ofsted inspectors that need to lose their jobs because of the way that they went about their inspections?
Well, we have a rigorous process of checking, and again, part of the changes that you make, sometimes they're external and people can see them, and sometimes they're internal as you look at the system. But as in with any organisation, when you've got thousands of staff, there'll be some people who you need to develop and some people who can't meet that level of development. But it is really important.
Did anyone get fired after Ruth Perry's death?
Well, I wouldn't talk about any individual, just as no one should talk about that from looking after a human resource point of view.
No, you don't have to name them. You just answer whether
you can tell us if anyone
should,
lost their job over
that. Well, I'm not going to talk about any individual inspector. That's not fair. But
Well, can you say that nobody lost their job?
I can say that people are inspect, and people no longer inspect over inspections, and it happens all the time.
So Martyn, I think this is basically, we're getting to the crux of the issue here, right? Which is that everything we've heard from teachers there is basically saying, who guards the guardians here? Because they're saying that often you can get a bad inspector, and that is completely arbitrary. Mm-hmm. And we have no means of controlling that. We have no means of reacting to it. They feel they don't really have a means of record.
You're not.
Precisely.
Yeah, well,
and how are you going to address that?
Well, we are accountable. We're accountable to
the Secretary of State, and that is so distant to the average school,
and to Parliament, who scrutinise
very distant
our
from
work.
The average school.
But we are accountable, and that's why, again, when I came in and I started talking in the first interviews that I've given in the role, and I'm carrying on saying, it's really important to me that Ofsted is of the system, by the system, for children and parents. And we do need to talk about what children and parents want from Ofsted. We inspect and regulate on their behalf, ultimately, not on behalf of government, on the behalf of the children and the parents. And so the more serving practitioners, the more people who are heads, teachers, leaders who are part of that inspection workforce, the better. And it also breaks that fourth wall. It stops people being anxious about the inspection because they understand the process and the way it works. And that's something that's really important to me, and I want to see that happen more and more.
So Martyn Oliver, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. So we're just thinking about that interview we've done with Sir Martyn Oliver. And I don't know about you, Emily, the thing that surprised me most about it was his reluctance to deviate from his predecessor's description and words.
Yeah, it would have been very easy.
Very easy. It would have just been very easy to say, those aren't words that I would have used, which is normally the formulation that when you have a new boss and they're taking over from a controversial predecessor, people say.
It's not hard to say, got the tone wrong. I guess he wants to be a team player, and he's coming in to a team that partly worked for her, that will now stay. I also thought that the difficulty was that he threw a lot of weight into this big conversation, big listen, whatever it's called, which I understand you don't want to make rash decisions immediately. You want to take your time. You want to sort of take the temperature. But fundamentally, you don't hear somebody saying, in this position of leadership, and as you heard, he's got 97,000 institutions that come under his, purview. He needs, therefore, to assume a position of leadership and confidence, I think, that he has the answers that seem to be lacking to many people. And actually, to go back to where it started, he kind of says it's fit for purpose, and you can always do better, but so can outstanding schools do better. I didn't hear any urgency from him that things really need to change or modify or improve.
Yeah, and as I said to him, I think, to be honest, we've been doing this story and we've been collecting voices. It hasn't taken long for us to get a pretty comprehensive sense from teachers about how the process could be improved.
Very simple ways that don't cost money.
Very, very simple ways. And so I'm not entirely convinced that anything that the big conversation unearths will be that drastically different to the points that we put to him. And I think that, what is clear is, and most of the teachers we heard from have said this, is that we absolutely do need a robust inspection model. it raises standards. Ultimately, this does have to be about the parents and the kids, not the teachers. But those aren't completely incompatible things. You know, having teachers who feel that the inspection regime is fair, is just, is proper, will feed through in terms of the sort of education that kids are getting. Because obviously teachers won't feel that, or be so overwhelmingly stressed about it, about the arbitrariness of it, when I think that is the key potential consideration.
It's a bit like the exam system itself, I guess, if you want to draw a comparison, which is you don't throw kids into an exam saying, some of you are going to sink and some of you are going to swim. You say, here's your revision, here's the process, here's the date that it will happen, here's what you can do to work towards the grade that you need. And so that the children themselves feel that they are able to prepare in a way that is not set against the system, but working within or towards the system.
And I suppose the other thing that I thought, just with these interviews that we've done today, in a way, obviously the Ofsted inspection regime is really, really important. Obviously everything that happened with Ruth Perry was really, really important, and it clearly needs reform. In a way, though, maybe we're sort of looking at it at the wrong end of the telescope, which is that we've heard from a lot of teachers saying, they feel burnout, they feel stressed, overworked, and Ofsted is part of that, and that is, of course, understandable. But as I say, we clearly do need a robust inspection regime. I think actually really the bigger problem in education is just the, vast number of problems with which we're actually kind of slightly boringly familiar, which is that we know that state school funding per pupil has basically stayed flat in real terms since 2010. That is a big, big problem. There's huge problems in terms of the school estate, in terms of capital investments, massive problems in terms of teacher recruitment and retention, and at the same time, again, if we're talking about safeguarding, the kind of wider problems of society, poverty, deprivation and so on, in many places have got worse and worse and worse, and schools are normally the kind of first port of call to deal with those problems on a day-to-day basis. So the pressures, the everyday pressures on teachers have gone up and up and up, and there isn't much sense, really, from any of the parties at the moment about how to strategically change that year to year in the medium term right now. And that's the thing that probably needs most focus of all, not the inspection regime.
And I think rightly we scrutinise safeguarding far more closely now than we did, when I was at school in the 1970s. And actually, we do demand criminal records checks. We do demand employment history. We do actually make a point of saying we need to know that you're clear, that we want to know where you've come from and what's been in your background. Yes, that creates more paperwork, quite frankly. That creates more of a sort of a bureaucracy. Would we change that? Would we go back to the old ways, like the days of Jimmy Savile? We would not. Yeah,
but I think, look, like so much of the rest of public policy right now, or politics right now, the truth is, right, everything is just in aspic. In a way, Sir Martyn alluded to it. Ultimately, his direction, not exclusively, but to some extent at least, comes from the Secretary of State. We're not going to have any changes on that until the election. Labour have sort of promised some minor changes around Ofsted and so on.
Labour actually have said they have committed to getting rid of the one-word slogan, assessment. So maybe he's thinking, as we all are, what's going to happen in the next 6 months? Tapping the fingers on the desk, abiding the time, doesn't need to make big changes because they'll all come at him anyway.
But as you said, there doesn't appear to be much sense of urgency one way or the other. We have plenty of urgency here, of course.
Who have you got tomorrow?
We're going to be talking to Vaughan Getting, the First Minister of Wales, who had an even bigger coterie when he came along and joined us. 7 people when we recorded it earlier in the week, even than the Chief Inspector of Ofsted. So
enjoy that.
It'll be something to look forward to.
Back tomorrow, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.